that was kind of a fun activity to see what you guys came up with, but how many of you think that God would have probably seen you in a slightly different light and come up with some other characteristics? Yeah, we did talk about this. So tonight I get the privilege of talking to you guys about the book of Judges, or week 8 in the story. And so I just want to kind of recap where we've come from throughout the Bible. So what are some of the things that have stood out to you in the past 7 weeks in the Bible? Okay, Numbers. Okay, doubt. Kara? Right, we keep seeing the cycle of, I love you, I don't need you. I love you, I don't need you. Okay. One thing that we've talked about in the past is this upper story, which is God's story. And that's kind of what I want to focus on tonight. So the book of Judges tells us a lot about these people and these individual people. But what we are seeing as the entire book progresses is how God continually and constantly is pursuing us, or in this case, the Israelites. So if we look back, we've seen how he came after Moses. He asked Abraham over and over. He's followed the Israelites throughout, or led them throughout the wilderness. And so even today, I don't know about you, but I feel like God is continually pursuing me. So he hasn't changed. And that's one thing that I think is really cool about God is from the beginning till now, God has stayed the same. It's how we see his story. So what God asks for us in return for his love is that we follow him and that we are holy, and that just means that we're set apart. And that can look very different in lots of situations. In the book of Judges, it says that God has already given them victory. Over and over, it talks about how God has already given them victory, and all he asks is that they follow his instruction, which seems pretty easy until we apply it to our lives. We're also going to see how Israel is persistent in forgetting God, and how God is faithful to discipline Israel and to deliver his people. And then we're also going to see how there is a tragic cycle of consequence for our actions. So how many of you love those consequences? Yeah, not me either. So the book of Judges begins with the battle of the Israelites against Canaan. And so Joshua is dead, right? We've come into the promised land, and the book of Judges starts with God saying the tribe of Judah is going to go take over this other area. And does Judah do it? Anybody know? It's in those first few words. Judah does do it, but they also ask the tribe of Simon to come along with them, or Simeon, sorry, to come with them. So they do it, but they're going to do it their way. They don't trust God. They're not going to do it God's way. And because they are not trusting God's way, they don't get their task. They fail to drive out all the people in Canaan. They don't kill them, and those people end up living with the Israelites. And it frustrates God. They failed because, one, they didn't believe in God, but two, they also didn't obey God. And I see that constantly in my life. I know what I'm supposed to do, but I always think I have a better way of doing it. I always tell everybody, I'm a control freak. I might give it to you, but I'm going to take it right back. And I do it with God. And I think we see that with the Israelites too. What do you want us to do? Oh, yes, we're going to follow your pillar of fire. But when we're tired of manna, we're going to ask for quail. And so we're going to kind of see some of that going on. If you guys have your Bibles, if you turn with me to Judges chapter 2. Chapter 2 of Judges is basically a summary of the entire book of Judges. So if you want a good overview, read chapter 2. But we are going to specifically look at verse 3 right now. In verse 3, God says, "So now I declare that I will no longer drive out the people living in your land. They will be thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a constant temptation for you." Do you think God's abandoned them? Nah, God's still there, right? It's just that he's going to show them some consequences of not obeying. And so I think that that's one thing. A lot of people are like, man, he's walking away. He's saying that their gods are going to be there, and he's not going to drive out these people in front of them. And God's not saying, I'm not here. God is saying, you need to trust me so that I can help you move forward. So when God says, these gods are going to be a thorn in your sides, the people weep. They sacrifice. And this is right before Joshua dies. And then they decide, we're going to serve God. We're going to do this. And everything is good. They serve God. They follow his way. And then Joshua dies. And then we start over. And we're going to see this constant cycle. When a new generation of people come, these people don't know about all of the wonders that they've seen throughout Joshua's lifetime. And the Israelites are again going to abandon the Lord and start to serve the Canaanites' god Baal. We're going to continue reading in chapter 2. We're going to go from verse 10 to 23. So it says, after that generation died, another generation grew up who did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the mighty things he had done for Israel. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. Those words are going to appear over and over and over. And served the images of Baal. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They went after other gods, worshiping the gods of the people around them. And they angered the Lord. They abandoned the Lord to serve Baal and the images of Ashtoreth. This made the Lord burn with anger against Israel, so he handed them over to the raiders who stole their possessions. He turned them over to their enemies all around, and they were no longer able to resist them. Every time Israel went out to battle, the Lord fought against them, causing them to be defeated, just as he had warned, and the people were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges to rescue the Israelites from their attackers. Yet Israel did not listen to the judges, but prostituted themselves by worshiping other gods. How quickly they turned away from the path of their ancestors who had walked in obedience to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge over Israel, he was with that judge and rescued the people from their enemies throughout the judge's lifetime. For the Lord took pity on his people who were burdened by oppression and suffering. But when the judge died, the people returned to their corrupt ways, behaving worse than those who had lived before them. They went after other gods, serving and worshiping them, and they refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. So the Lord burned with anger against Israel. He said, because these people have violated my covenant, which I made with their ancestors, and have ignored my commands, I will no longer drive out the nations that Joshua left unconquered when he died. I did this to test Israel, to see whether they would or not follow the ways of the Lord as their ancestors did. That is why the Lord left those nations in place. He did not quickly drive them out or allow Joshua to conquer them all. So that's going to show us the cycle of sin. And I didn't get this to Reg in time to put it up on the computer. So I have this really cool circle. So we're going to talk about the cycle of sin and the steps of the cycle of sin real quick. So first of all, we have Israel serving the Lord. Everything's good. Or as Rick said this weekend, we are all in. And then we fall into sin and idolatry. We might call this rebellion. Then Israel is enslaved. This is going to be retribution. So this is when you say, but Mom, that's not fair. I shouldn't be grounded. After a period of time, then Israel is going to cry out to the Lord and they repent. So God raises up a judge and he restores his people. And then Israel is delivered and they're all in again. And then after that judge has died and they're all in and that judge dies, that cycle is just going to repeat over and over and over. And that's kind of what the book of Judges is showing us. So there are 7 cycles of sin in the book of Judges. We are not going to talk about all of them. There are a lot of great judges. If you were here this weekend, Rick talked about Ehud. He talked about Shamgar. Tonight we're going to talk about 3 judges. But I think that it's important not to just know the names and the places, but to kind of get the overall view. And it's showing this that when we cry out, God will always answer. It may not be what we want to hear, but God is always faithful in answering. So we're first going to talk about Deborah. So Deborah is a pretty unlikely hero in the book of Judges. Do you guys have any idea why? She's a woman. Okay. Why is that important? Anybody that wasn't in small group tonight? Okay, Lucas. right? Women were really nothing back in those days. So, in that time period, women were very restricted. It wasn't just that they were thought of nothing, they were often treated as property. Men married them for alliances. Not necessarily for love, and men could have multiple wives. A lot of times, the women weren't allowed to go out in public. They weren't allowed to talk to strangers. They couldn't be in a public venue and speak. And so, women were very restricted. And Deborah was also a prophet. So it wasn't like she came up to people and said, this is what's happening. It says that she had a place under a tree that people came to her for advice. And so this is kind of where the story of Deborah is going to start. So she has a message from God, and she goes to Barak. So Barak is this mighty warrior, and she says, God has commanded you to go to battle, and he has already given you victory. Cool, right? I'm going to win. Let's do this. Not quite. He's like, I'll go, but only if you go with me. And so Deborah agrees to go, but she tells Barak, if you decide you're going, if I have to go with you, the victory will not be yours, but it will be given to a woman. And so if we look through the Bible and we look at the story, she doesn't necessarily say, don't do this. She encourages him. Follow God's command. Obey God. Go do this. He's already given you victory. But if you won't and I must go, then these are the consequences. And so they go into battle, and she stays behind. Women are not warriors. And she stays back, and they go out, and they are starting to fight the army. And Sisera, who is the commander, escapes. He escapes into a tent of a woman who gives him drink, allows him to take a nap, and while he's sleeping, she kills him. Okay? So a woman wins the battle. Which is a little ironic because just shortly after that happens, Barak comes up to the tent. Have you seen him? She's like, yes, let me show you. So it's a little ironic, but it also shows how God had given them victory, but if we are not going to obey God's commands and we have our own way of doing it, his will still be done, but it may not look quite the same as what we expect. All right, our second judge we're going to talk about is Gideon. Gideon is one of my favorite characters in this book. Gideon sees himself as the weak person. He says, but my clan is the least of the clan, the weakest clan, and I am the least of my family. And an angel comes up to him, and that is not how he describes him. So when the angel finds Gideon, he is in the bottom of a wine press, and he is threshing wheat. So we're down in a well, taking a little bit of wheat, and mashing it up so nobody's going to steal it. We're hiding, right? That's how Gideon saw himself. He had to hide from the world. He couldn't protect what was his. And so the angel of the Lord says, mighty hero. If you think you're the weakest person, do you see yourself as a hero? I wouldn't. He says, mighty hero, the Lord is with you. And it goes on to say, go with strength and go with the strength you have and rescue Israel. I am sending you. And that's how God sees Gideon. And that's kind of why we did the superhero game. Because God doesn't always just see what we see on the external. God looks at our hearts. He looks at our availability. And he's looking for somebody who is going to obey him and be able to show the true face of God to the rest of the world. But Gideon is not exactly perfect. Gideon is going to test God. He says, okay, I'll do this, but I need to know if this is real. So wait here while I go get a sacrifice. He tells the angel, just wait. And the angel waits. He's like, okay, this is legit. So he goes into battle, and before they're getting ready to go down and start the big fight, Gideon is going to test God not once but twice. And he uses a piece of fleece that's laying on the ground. And he says, God, if this is true, if you're going to be with me, then let this fleece be wet and let all of the ground around it stay dry. And it happens. That'd be good enough for me. It's not good enough for Gideon. He's a little shaken yet. And so he says, okay, this time let me use the fleece again. Let it stay dry, but let the ground be wet. And then I'll go. You see that if-then game? And so God does it. God keeps that fleece. He gives him the signs, and he lets Gideon know that he is going to be protected. He's going to live. And so Gideon goes into battle. And he has 32,000 men that are available to go into battle. We got this. We're a big army. And God says, no, no, no. That's too many. You guys could do this by your own strength. So he has some tests and he starts whittling away the numbers. If any of you is afraid, if you even have an inkling of fear, leave now. And 10,000 men leave. And he says, nope, that's still too many. So he has them go down by the water, and they're supposed to drink from the river. And he says, whoever cups the water in their hands to drink it, send them home. But whoever laps it like a dog, that's who we're taking into battle. And there are 300 men. So Gideon and his 300 men go into battle. Why? Why 300 men when there were 32,000? Absolutely. So if 32,000 men went in and they conquered this other army, sure, we can do that. But when we say 300 men took out this huge army, that wasn't by our strength alone. That was God. And that's what God was doing. He was showing that it was not by their strength. It is not by our strength alone, but through God's strength that we are able to do those tasks. So God gives a simple message so that we can come to know him. And oftentimes he'll use the different problems that we encounter. So in this case, it was Midian, who was the army that Gideon was fighting against. And it brings the people to a place of weakness so that they know that they can totally rely on God. All right, our third judge we're going to look at tonight is Samson. Samson is also a pretty unlikely hero. So why is Samson an unlikely hero? We see he's strong, he's brave, he's big. Why is Samson an unlikely hero? Okay, he's a womanizer. Bring me that woman. She looks good to me. He is disobedient. Do you guys know what a Nazarite is? Okay, so Samson's mom was barren. She was not able to have children. And they had prayed to God. And finally, an angel came and said, you are going to have a baby. You are going to have a son, and you need to not drink wine. You need to not let him drink, not cut his hair. He is going to be raised as a Nazarite. And there are 3 big rules for Nazarites. So no alcohol, don't cut their hair, and the third one is they are not supposed to touch a dead body. And during his life, Samson disobeyed every one of those things. So if you look in Gideon's story, it's kind of towards the end of Judges, you're going to see that he kills a lion and he comes back and there's honey inside this lion. And even though he knows he's not supposed to touch any dead bodies, he goes in and he eats the honey. And then he takes them home to his mom and dad. But knowing that it's wrong, he's not going to tell them where it's from. A little bit down the story, it's talking about when he's getting married to his first wife, who's a Philistine woman, and it talks about the wedding celebration. And if you look back into some other books and look at the wedding celebrations, it was not just, hey, we're going to dinner. This was like an all-out fest. So more than likely, he was a little tipsy. And then at the end of the story, we will also see how Gideon cuts his hair, or Samson, cuts his hair. So we also see Samson showing disregard for most of God's commands. So he does marry a Philistine woman who is the culture that is basically enslaving the Israelites at this time. He's very angry. He does treat women with disrespect. And so there's a lot of characteristics that we wouldn't necessarily say he's a man of God. But even though Samson disobeys everything that God tells him, he is still able to defeat the Philistines. So God gives him strength. He lets him go against these 30 men and find garments to repay a debt after his first wife betrays him. He's able to tie all these foxes together, pairs of foxes, and he sets them on fire so that they burn down all of the crops. He goes out and he kills 1,000 soldiers with the jawbone of a donkey. That sounds a little surreal. And then at the end of his life, he's been tricked by Delilah. And so he's been captured. They've blinded him. They've enslaved him. And they bring him into this arena, and Samson prays, God, just give me the strength one more time. Just be with me one more time. And he is able to tear down the pillars. And in his death, he kills more Philistines than he has killed in his entire life. So I think that Samson is a little bit of a wake-up call for us. We have to be alert of the different ways that the enemies are coming after us. So for him, it was his wives, both of them. They tricked him. And I know in our small group tonight, we talked about the power of a woman over a man and how, you know, women can have such a big role in what the man is going to say, and that we need to make sure that we are taking that power and using it correctly, and not necessarily to tear down or destroy our husbands or our society. But I also think that Samson shows us something about compromise and knowing things about the world, because Samson knew the culture of the Philistines, and he still went into that culture. He exposed himself to it. So I think that we need to make sure that we're aware of what's going on and how to protect ourselves. We've talked about surrounding yourself with positive influences and people that are like-minded. All right, so let's conclude this. So a couple of things that we see. This is God's plan. God uses flawed, failing, and sinful people for his purpose. Thank the Lord, because if not, we would be in trouble, because I don't know about you, but I fall into all three of those categories. One thing that I always like the saying, God does not call the equipped, he equips the called. And so God doesn't ask us to know everything or to have all of the resources available. He just asks us to make ourselves available and say yes when he asks, and to obey what he's asking us to do. The message in Judges is going to show that even though we fall into the cycles of sin, it's a cycle that we can break. And so those judges broke the cycle each time. And it's important that we need to call out to God. If we don't call out to God, we're going to stay in that enslaved cycle. And sometimes all we need is somebody who's positive that can lead us right back into that, that path that we are supposed to be following. We're going to close in Hebrews. So if you turn to Hebrews chapter 11, Hebrews brings up the judges one more time. We're going to read verses 32 through 34. It says, how much more do I need to say? It would take too long to recount the stories of the faith of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and all the prophets. By faith, these people overthrew kingdoms, ruled with justice, and received what God had promised them. They shut the mouths of lions, quenched the flames of fire, and escaped death by the edge of the sword. Their weakness was turned to strength. They became strong in battle and put whole armies to flight. That was really all I had for you guys tonight. So
all right. Is this on? Is this on? There we go. There it's on. Hey, give Amy another round of applause.